Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I want to talk about something a little bit different than our normal content here today, and that is a discussion of the massive similarities between the Winter War, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. This first jumped out at me when I was looking at pictures from the Finnish archives of the Winter War, at the same time that there was a bunch of snowfall in Ukraine. And there were pictures showing up on social media out of Ukraine of destroyed Russian vehicles under a blanket of a couple inches of snow. And at the exact same time that I'm seeing those come in, I'm also looking at the Finnish Army archive photos of Russian vehicles destroyed in convoys under a blanket of a couple inches of snow. And it really struck me how very similar these two images look. You update the model of the vehicle by about 50 years, and you could, part of me wanted to just play around with taking some of the Ukrainian images, converting them to black and white, and seeing if I could find Finnish images that actually had like the same type of, or the same basic type of vehicle in the same configuration, in the same patterns, in the same shot design. Anyway. I didn't actually do that, but it made me start thinking about just how many similarities there are between these two wars, and also how there are some very substantial differences that may have a significant impact on the outcome in Ukraine. So if we start by looking at the similarities, the motivation for the Russian invasion and the manner of the initial invasion were fairly similar. In the case of Finland, Russia was concerned, Stalin specifically, was concerned that the Finns would allow Germany to attack Russia through the Karelian Isthmus. That's the southern land connection between Finland and Russia. There's a Karelian Isthmus, and then there's a gigantic lake, which is Lake Ladoga, and then there's a long stretch, 1,000-some kilometers of border, but it's up in the north in the forests. There are not many people up there, not much road infrastructure. It's the Karelian Isthmus where all of the modern transportation happened and where easy accessibility was. And that's where a German invasion could, theoretically, have come. And so Stalin, after some initial attempts to simply have the Finns give him the whole isthmus, decided to throw a false flag attack, pretend that the Finns had attacked a Russian border station and use that as the justification for a full-scale invasion of Finland. And we saw a fairly clear Russian preparation to try and do the exact same thing in Ukraine. Now, there wasn't quite as specific of a threat in Ukraine. In Finland, it's not just that the Germans could invade through the north, it's that an invasion like that, the Finnish border is only about 20 miles from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and that was a significant strategic threat to Russia. If we look at the initial invasion, this is one of the places where there are vast similarities between the two wars. The Russian troops in Finland were unprepared, overconfident. They expected that they would cross the border and meet jubilant Finnish support, that Finnish citizen population would see themselves as being liberated by Russian troops. They thought that this could very well foment a communist uprising, that they could convince the workers to overthrow this bourgeois Finnish white government that was exploiting them. And very similar to what it appears Putin thought would happen with units invading Ukraine, that the Ukrainians would rise up and join the Russians and exult in being liberated from their oppressive Ukrainian government. And of course, that didn't happen there either. On the contrary, in both cases, the invasion dramatically unified and solidified national interest in both Finland and Ukraine. The competing political parties in Finland in the 1930s, which had been at fairly serious loggerheads with each other. There was still some unresolved tension from the Finnish Civil War in 1918, 1919 of the whites against the reds. But the political parties came together quickly and very cohesively and joined forces against the Russians. The Russians were unable to politically divide Finland, just like they've been unable to effectively politically divide Ukraine in the way they expected. Because of some of these expectations, there were some fairly ludicrous things that were found in the Russian convoys going into Finland. There were divisions that came into Finland, up north in Finland even, with complete equipment for brass bands, with flags. They came in with the equipment for a celebratory parade through Helsinki or one of the other, Tampere or Oulu. And, I mean, Finnish troops who cut off and destroy a convoy and then go looking through the supply trucks and discover a brass band worth of musical instruments found this quite entertaining. And we saw some similar sorts of things in Ukraine. One of the really significant limitations of Russian mechanized units in Ukraine has been the necessity to stay on roads, both because of poor maintenance on things like tires, but also because of the incredibly sticky, muddy, gloppy spring conditions prevalent in Ukraine this time of year. Something that, by the way, the Russians really should have known about, but obviously they planned for a much different campaign, a quick, decisive campaign full of Ukrainian collaboration or help that they didn't get. Well, in Finland, there was a similar effect, although for different reasons. Particularly in the northern part of the conflict, Russian convoys had to stay on roads, which, just like in the Ukraine, made them easy targets for ambush by smaller, more mobile Finnish units, and smaller, more mobile Ukrainian units. In Finland, it was because the forests essentially prevented any effective tank movement off of the roads. The forests are thick enough that you're not driving a convoy hundreds of miles bushwhacking through forests. They have to stay on the roads. And of course, the snow. Tanks may be able to move through snow a bit better than trucks, but your trucks are not driving through, bushwhacking through the forest in the winter. It's just impossible. And so again, this made these convoys easy prey for Finnish ambushes. In both cases, the country being invaded was vastly outnumbered. The Finns were outnumbered by a factor of somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on what time period in the war and what numbers you use. We have a similar situation with the Ukrainians being significantly outnumbered, especially in terms of armored vehicles by the Russian army. In both cases, the Russians achieved basically air superiority. The Finns had a small air force, as the Ukrainians did, depending on how many of them are still left. In neither case, the Finns were not able to effectively really push back against Russian air power, but the Russians were unable to really effectively exploit that air power in a meaningful way. The Russians had significant problems with poorly trained troops in Finland. They chose soldiers from much farther down south, soldiers without any winter fighting experience or soldiers who had not grown up in an environment like northern Finland in the winter. The Winter War, by the way, as its name suggests, starts at the very end of November and will run through March. So it's winter and early spring. Again, there were Finnish units that, having destroyed supply convoys, picked through the material that was there and discovered boxes of manuals for how to use skis. Well, once you've already gotten into Finland as an invading force, that is not the best time to try and learn how to ski. You probably ought to have done that well before you actually crossed the border into Finland. And they didn't. So there were cases where there were Russian troops who had skis but didn't know how to use them. I don't know that there's a direct correlation there to anything in Ukraine, but similar problems with Russian troop effectiveness. There were also issues of Russians targeting specifically civilian infrastructure. There were bombing raids on Helsinki that simply bombed the city at large in an attempt to break Finnish morale, civilian morale, which, as one will see from basically all warfare ever with strategic bombing, didn't work, but did raise significant international outrage over the direct targeting of civilians. Less significant, I think, substantially less significant than what we're seeing in Ukraine now. There wasn't as much civilian involvement in the fighting in Finland in the Winter War, because up north there were not very many significant settlements. There were towns that were fought over, but those towns were typically fairly small and were evacuated before becoming the scene of battles. In the south, the civilians were evacuated out from the fortified areas. And so there wasn't an equivalent to, say, Mariupol in the Winter War, which is good for the Finns. There are some similarities in overall grand strategy. The original Russian plan for the Winter War was to attack up through the Karelian Isthmus to break the main Finnish defenses and take Helsinki, while at the same time having forces along the northern border between the two countries attack straight through to the west with the intention of cutting Finland in half, isolating the northern half from the south, and then presumably splitting apart and occupying both parts of the country. That completely failed to work, because the Russian forces were unable to actually traverse the width of the country. They were, in fact, unable to traverse even half the width of the country, because they were stuck on roads. They were, the convoys of Russian equipment were blocked, attacked, basically put under siege, cut into pieces, and piecemeal destroyed, outflanked, forced to retreat, in other ways rendered combat ineffective. This was called moti tactics. The word comes from cutting firewood into stove-sized pieces of wood. It's a term that wasn't used during the Winter War, but was applied to the tactics after the fact, essentially taking a long column, blocking the front, blocking the back, and then launching attacks out of the forest to cut the convoy into pieces. A relatively small number of troops could then maintain harassing attacks on all the different parts of the convoy, forcing it to essentially create a defensive emplacement. And then slightly larger Finnish forces could attack each single segment of that convoy one at a time, create a local superiority, destroy that segment, and then move on to the next one, in effect allowing a small Finnish unit to destroy a much larger Russian unit. And this is similar to what we've seen in Ukraine with the attack towards Kyiv, where the Russian units were stuck on roads. They were unable to, the idea was take Kyiv and have forces coming up from the south in Crimea, cut the country in half, and render its defense much more difficult. Same thing, failed to happen because the two forces were unable to meet their objectives and unable to meet in the center of the country in this case. It's also interesting to note that even at a tactical level, a lot of the problems of the Russian forces in the Winter War are in fact being repeated in the invasion of Ukraine. In particular, a lack of coordination between units that are fighting side by side. There were a lot of instances in the south, on the Karelian Isthmus, where a Russian unit would be able to break through defenses on the Mannerheim line in a specific, discrete location, but the communication and coordination between the Russian units was inferior, and the Russian army was unable to exploit those gaps to throw more reserves into a specific breakthrough. Instead, they waited too long, and the Finns were time after time able to regroup a small force, counterattack, and retake the positions that they had lost. So the Mannerheim line was not a static, impenetrable defense. It was actually broken through more than a few times, but Russian coordination was insufficient to allow those breakthroughs to actually be exploited. And you see some of that still on a tactical level with the Russian forces in Ukraine, with a lack of infantry support of armored vehicles. Same thing goes for the Winter War. This was a problem for the Russians. And a lack of coordination between units side by side to exploit local advantages. And of course, before I start talking about some of the differences between these two wars, I have to, of course, comment on captured tanks. Because when the Winter War began, Finland had very, very few tanks. And when the Winter War ended, they had substantially more tanks than they had started with. because they captured a lot of Russian tanks that were disabled or abandoned. Now, they didn't tow them away with tractors, but as something that just really jumps out as a glaring similarity between the two wars. Finland's tank corps was essentially equipped with captured Russian tanks. And we see the same thing in Ukraine. I think I have seen numbers that Ukraine has captured more tanks than it actually started the war with. So, that's an embarrassing problem to have if you're the Russian army. Now, let's talk about how the Winter War ended, because I think a lot of people who just have a very casual, surface level understanding of the Winter War have this view that the Finns essentially just demolished the Russians and the Russians had to surrender. And that really was not the case. From the very beginning, even before the war started, Field Marshal Mannerheim, the Finnish overall commander, was begging the government to come to a diplomatic solution, to figure out something, because he did not believe that the Finnish armed forces were capable of winning a war against Russia. He viewed the Finnish army as under-equipped, untrained. Equipment was in poor condition. What they did have, the static defenses in the Karelian Isthmus were woefully insufficient, and Mannerheim was not optimistic about the possibilities of this war. Now, once the war started, he threw 100% into it and did extremely well in maintaining a successful defense. However, when the war ended in March, the Finnish army was probably 1 to 2 weeks away from complete and utter collapse. And Mannerheim's strategy was to prevent the Russians from learning that at all costs. Late in the war, negotiations had begun through the Swedish embassy with Russia, and it was imperative for Mannerheim to maintain this image that the Finns had an inexhaustible supply of defensive troops, that they were never going to budge, that the Mannerheim lines, 3 of them at this point, would hold, and it was just not worth Russia throwing division after division after division to be destroyed up in front of the Finnish fortifications. The reality was supplies, troops, ammunition, morale were all getting thin. Units were taking significant casualties every single day. They were forced to retreat from the main Mannerheim line back to a second and then a third line of defenses, and each line of defenses was progressively less significant, less well prepared, less protective. And low-level Finnish commanders were desperate to be able to abandon that third line, retreat, and adopt more strategically defensible positions. And Mannerheim forbade this from happening because he needed to keep that third line there until he was able to get a negotiated settlement, a treaty, and a ceasefire with the Russians. Had the Russians learned how close they were to completely breaking through in the Isthmus, they never would have signed a peace treaty. Stalin would have happily thrown that last extra wave of troops in to be able to go actually win the war instead of have to accept a negotiated peace. So it's gratifying to think of the Finns in the Winter War as essentially invulnerable and invincible defenders. The truth of the matter was they had a limited amount of time that they were going to be capable of maintaining a defense. And when all the Russians had to do was dump enough human life onto the Finnish defenses to overwhelm it, and eventually they would, and they would be able to militarily win the war. In some ways, this is similar to the propaganda side of the war in Ukraine, which is a front that really didn't exist in the Winter War. In fact, Mannerheim was pretty serious about preventing any reporters from getting into the Karelian Isthmus because he didn't want the Russians, by way of Western press, to start to see how many soldiers were being lost in the Isthmus, and he didn't want the Finnish population to see the losses that the Finnish army was taking. It was holding, but it was taking losses all the time, and this is similar to what is actually going on in Ukraine. the Ukrainian army is doing a masterful job on the PR/propaganda front of this war. And what we see is a string of nonstop Ukrainian victories. We're not talking grand strategy victories, but Ukrainian triumphant moments. And the Russians are doing an absolutely terrible job of showing any of that in Western media. But regardless of what's being seen in Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, social media, the Ukrainian army is taking losses every day, and it does not have an infinite number of troops or an infinite amount of equipment. And so one of the potential outcomes of this war is something that could be similar to what happened in the Winter War, where Ukraine is able to maintain a stand to negotiate an end to the war. In the case of Finland, they gave up about 9 or 10% of their sovereign territory as part of that treaty, including the entirety of the Karelian Isthmus and the port of Petsamo in the north. Would Ukraine be willing to accept that? It's unclear. This is an area where there are significant differences. Ukraine is a much larger country than Finland, and its strategic calculation is going to be different. In addition, there are some very significant differences between the Winter War and the invasion of Ukraine. And I think a big one is the international response. The international response to the Winter War was one of pretty much universal Western sympathy, thoughts and prayers, basically, but a significant lack of actual material assistance. There were, I think it was like 12,000, 13,000 foreign volunteers actually came to Finland to participate in the war, to help fight. By far the biggest group of them, the majority of them were Swedish, a lot of Swedish army personnel. In fact, the Swedish army allowed Swedish army personnel to take leave and go fight in Finland. And there was an entire Swedish commanded, Swedish officered unit, the Swedish Volunteer Corps. There were Norwegians, there were Danes, there were Americans, there were people of many other nationalities that also came to volunteer. They were not in substantial enough numbers to have their own complete units. And it's interesting and a lot of those volunteers weren't fighting on the front lines. But like in Ukraine, there were a significant number of foreign volunteers that came to Finland to help fight. But there was virtually no actual formal international government assistance. There was talk by both the British and the French governments of sending expeditionary forces, which could have been a huge game changer. The problem was these were not really legitimate attempts to help Finland. These were basically ways to camouflage sending British or French troops into Sweden to restrict German access to Swedish iron ore. The French and the British really wanted to get troops into Sweden and Norway, and Finland was a convenient excuse to be able to do that. The French and British plans to assist in Finland were not actually based on assisting the Finns, and ultimately none of those plans actually took place. No foreign official troops from anyone other than Sweden actually arrived. There was basically no military support. There was some material that was supplied to Finland. It was almost exclusively pretty obsolete material. Airplanes, for example, a lot of it didn't arrive until after the end of the war. And in contrast to that, we see the Ukrainian military getting piles and piles of equipment from NATO and the United States. And they're getting really good equipment. They're getting very capable anti-tank and anti-aircraft missile systems, and now it appears that that's scaling up to include armored vehicles, aircraft, and other really significant military hardware. And the Finns did not have any of that. On top of that, the Ukrainian army, I think it can be effectively argued that the Ukrainian army at the start of the invasion was a significantly more capable force than the Finnish army was at the start of its invasion. A lot of the Finnish army's effectiveness came from basic individual marksmanship based on things like Finnish Civil Guard, marksmanship skills that were built on many years of training and competition. The Finnish army had very few tanks. It had an effective but small and obsolete air force that frankly wasn't a huge strategic player. And the Finns had almost nothing to counter Russian armor. They were using Molotov cocktails and anti-tank mines. The Ukrainian military is in the position of having been invaded first in 2014 and 2015 and doing really poorly. And that acted as a wake-up call that allowed Ukraine 8 years of military reform and training and recognizing that it needed to get better and having the time and space to get better with international support, so that when the invasion actually happened in February 2022, they were, well, like I said, they were a much more capable force than they had been in 2014. And I think that's been a huge element in allowing them to be as successful as they have been. Between that and the massive international support, in the Winter War, what essentially happened was the Winter War fractured European cooperation, where the invasion of Ukraine has cemented European cooperation. And so where we see the necessity of Finland essentially surrendering a significant part of its landmass in order to achieve a ceasefire, that may not be necessary in Ukraine, because there are some of these significant advantages that the Ukrainians today have over the Finns from 1940. Anyway, hopefully that was of some interest to you. I found the comparison between these two conflicts very, very interesting, having dug into the Winter War a fair amount in recent months. So anyway, tomorrow we'll be back to the regular content, interesting forgotten weapons. So stick around for that. Thank you for watching, and that's all I got.